In 1985, a NASA computer scientist named Rick Briggs published a paper. Not about rockets, not about satellites, not about anything you'd expect from NASA. He published a paper about a language spoken on the Indian subcontinent 5,000 years ago. And buried inside his argument was a sentence that has never fully left the internet since. He called Sanskrit, quote, a language especially well suited for computer processing. Now, why would a NASA scientist be reading ancient Indian texts? What was he looking for? And does it have anything to do with what those same texts describe? Flying machines, capable of moving in any direction, powered by forces we still don't fully understand. That's what we're going to find out today. Let's start with what the texts actually say, because people love to either wildly exaggerate this or completely dismiss it. Both are wrong. The Ramayana, one of ancient India's two great epics, describes something called a Pushpaka Vimana. It's the vehicle of the demon king Ravana. The text describes it as self-moving, capable of flying through the air, large enough to carry multiple passengers, and so beautiful that it shone like the sun. Now, you can read that as poetry, as metaphor, as myth. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mahabharata, the other great epic, 5 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, doesn't just mention Vimanas once, it mentions them hundreds of times. And the descriptions get specific. They describe Vimanas that can become invisible, Vimanas that can travel underwater, Vimanas that move faster than thought, Vimanas that shoot weapons of terrifying power. A manuscript, allegedly dictated by a man named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, claimed to be the transcription of an ancient text, a technical manual for building Vimanas. It was called the Vaimanika Shastra. Most historians read this as ancient imagination, the same way we might describe a superhero flying in a modern film. But then, in 1904, something unusual was discovered.
The Vaimanika Shastra is one of the strangest documents in the history of aviation. It claims to describe, in precise Sanskrit, the construction of multiple types of aircraft. It includes chapters on materials, on metallurgy, on propulsion, on piloting, on mirrors and lenses used for surveillance, on diet and clothing for pilots at high altitude. It describes specific alloys, mixtures of metals the author claims are lightweight and heat-resistant. It talks about a substance called Raja Loha, a dark metal, and Soma Chakra, a type of rotor. There are 97 technical problems discussed, 32 types of Vimana named, and most remarkably, diagrams, hand-drawn technical illustrations that look, at first glance, startlingly like blueprints. Now, here's the problem that serious researchers immediately flagged. The manuscript surfaced in 1904, but it claimed to be a channeled text, meaning Pandit Shastri said he received it psychically from an ancient sage named Bharadwaja. In 1974, a team of scientists and engineers at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore conducted a formal aeronautical analysis of the Vaimanika Shastra. Their conclusion was blunt. The aircraft designs described would not fly. Some were aerodynamically impossible. The technical descriptions, they argued, showed no real understanding of the principles of flight. That should be the end of the story. Except it's not quite that simple. Because the question of whether the Vaimanika Shastra specifically is ancient or genuine is actually separate from the question of whether ancient India had sophisticated aeronautical thinking. And that's where NASA enters the picture. no physical ancient manuscript has ever been found.
Rick Briggs wasn't studying the Vaimanika Shastra. He wasn't studying Vimanas at all. He was working on one of the most frustrating problems in early computing. How do you make a machine understand human language? This was the 1980s. Natural language processing was in its infancy. The problem was that human languages are messy. English, French, Mandarin, they're full of ambiguity. Context changes meaning. Irony, sarcasm. The sentence, "I never said she stole my money," has 7 different meanings depending on which word you stress. Computers hate that. Briggs' insight, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, was that Sanskrit is structurally different from most human languages. Around 400 BCE, a grammarian named Panini wrote a text called the Ashtadhyayi. In it, he described the rules of Sanskrit grammar using roughly 4,000 concise rules called sutras. The system was so complete, so internally consistent, that many linguists consider it the first formal grammar ever written, and one that rivals modern formal logic. What makes Sanskrit remarkable from a computational standpoint is this. The meaning of a sentence in Sanskrit is not dependent on word order. It's encoded in suffixes, changes to the ends of words that precisely indicate the relationship between any 2 concepts. In other words, in Sanskrit, ambiguity is systematically eliminated by the grammar itself. Briggs argued this made Sanskrit a kind of natural bridge between human thought and machine language, a language already structured like code. Now, does this prove ancient Indians built flying machines? No, absolutely not. That would be a massive logical leap. But what it does tell us is that the intellectual tradition that produced texts about Vimanas was one of extraordinary rigor. A culture that could produce Panini's grammar was a culture capable of astonishing systematic thought. And here's the thread that connects everything. Some of those ancient texts were written down in a grammatical framework so precise that a NASA researcher in 1985 found it useful for artificial intelligence. That's not pseudoscience, that's a documented fact. The question is, what else did that same tradition record that we haven't looked at carefully enough? Let's ask the hard question directly. Could the aircraft described in ancient Indian texts actually fly? The honest answer is almost certainly not as described. And here's why the analysis matters. Not to dismiss the texts, but to understand what they are. When the 1974 Bangalore team ran their analysis of the Vaimanika Shastra designs, they found several critical problems. The descriptions of propulsion are vague and contradictory. Some designs reference Mercury vortex engines, a concept that appears in multiple ancient Indian texts. The idea being that spinning Mercury in some kind of gyroscopic chamber would generate thrust. Modern engineers have looked at this seriously. There is no known mechanism by which this would produce lift. Mercury does have interesting electromagnetic properties, but nothing we understand today would make it a viable propellant. The structural materials described don't match known ancient metallurgy. Some of the alloys mentioned simply haven't been identified in archaeological records. And the aerodynamics of the described shapes, in most cases, are not flyable. But here's what's genuinely interesting, and what keeps serious researchers engaged rather than just dismissing the whole thing. There are isolated details in ancient Indian texts that are harder to explain away. The Artha Shastra, a very real, very ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, written around 300 BCE, makes references to flying machines in contexts that feel strangely practical, not mythological. It discusses their use in warfare and espionage.
There are ancient Indian coins and seals that some researchers interpret as depicting craft that look like they could be flying vehicles, though mainstream archaeology disputes most of these readings. And there is the deeper question of transmission. Ancient India had extraordinary knowledge in mathematics, medicine, and metallurgy that reached the rest of the world slowly and indirectly. Some things were lost, some things we're still recovering. The question isn't, did ancient Indians have 747s? They didn't. The more interesting question is, was there systematic thinking about controlled, engineered flight happening in ancient India, thousands of years before the Wright brothers? The text suggests the answer might be yes, even if the technology never reached the level the most dramatic interpretations claim.
So where does this leave us? The NASA connection is real, but it's about language and computation, not flying machines. Rick Briggs genuinely published a paper arguing Sanskrit's grammatical structure made it useful for artificial intelligence research. That paper is real. You can read it. The link is in the description. What he was not saying is that ancient Indians had spacecraft, or that the Vaimanika Shastra is a genuine ancient blueprint. The Vaimanika Shastra is almost certainly a 20th century document, presented as ancient. The aeronautics described wouldn't work. The 1974 engineering analysis was rigorous, and its conclusions are credible. But the broader tradition of Indian thought that produced the texts about Vimanas was one of genuine intellectual sophistication. Panini's grammar is real. The mathematics of ancient India is real. Zero, the decimal system, early algebra. The surgical texts of Sushruta describe procedures that wouldn't be performed in the West for centuries. It is not impossible, not even particularly surprising, that systematic thought about flight existed in this intellectual environment, even if the technology to execute it never fully developed. The lesson isn't ancient Indians had flying machines. The lesson is more interesting than that. It's that the line between mythology, theoretical knowledge, and engineering isn't always as clean as we think, and that civilizations we sometimes imagine as purely pre-scientific were doing things with thought and language and mathematics that still surprise us. NASA didn't study Sanskrit because they found a flying machine. They studied it because someone noticed that a language developed thousands of years ago was structured with a rigor that computers could understand. And if that's what was hiding in plain sight in the grammar, what else might be waiting in the rest of the texts? That's a question worth asking. If this kind of thing interests you, real history that's stranger than most fiction, then you'll want to watch the next video on this channel, because we're going to look at another ancient Indian text. This one describes surgical procedures so advanced that they include techniques for reconstructing the human nose, a procedure that European surgeons only learned about in the 1700s. When they learned it. From India. That video is up next. I'll see you there.